Hi, everybody. If you could take your seats, that would be great. I hope you had a beautiful lunch. Welcome back to Circulations. My name is Emily Steiner. I'm a medievalist in the English department here at Penn. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our two speakers for the session. Can everyone hear okay? Is the sound working?
Yeah.
Okay. Our first speaker is Dr. Agata Paluch from the Free University of Berlin, who is a scholar of Jewish Kabbalistic texts from manuscript to early print culture. She is the head of the Emmy Noda Research Group, Patterns of Knowledge Circulation, the Transmission and Reception of Jewish Esoteric Knowledge in Manuscript and Print in Early Modern East Central Europe. Her first book, published in 2014, concerns a famous Polish mystic, Nathan Neda ben Shlomo Shapiro. Dr. Paluch has held postdoctoral fellowships from the Gerda Henkel Foundation, our own Katz Center, and from the Humboldt. Her talk today is entitled Circulating Esoteric Knowledge, Kabbalistic Manuscripts in Early Modern East Central Europe. Please welcome Dr. Paluch.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to talk at the Symposium. Today I will discuss two examples, it works, of scribal production from Eastern Central Europe, a region known as Ashkenaz, to examine the mechanism of control and circulation of manuscripts that shaped Jewish esoteric forms of knowledge and their understandings in the early modern period. So the manuscripts I will present today share a common feature. They copy or extract and compile texts from Kabbalistic literatures, arguably the dominant force in Jewish religious culture during the early modernity. So briefly, Kabbalah. It's broadly defined as a spectrum of Jewish mystical lore, originated as an esoteric textual tradition transmitted among the initiates. It explored the structure of the Godhead, often represented as a structure of 10 divine emanations, and its dynamic relations with the Kabbalist practitioner and the physical world. By the 16th century, Kabbalistic literature in its various forms had become one of the most popular genres among Jewish readers. Although often described as exclusive and elite form of knowledge, Kabbalah developed many facets, reaching readers and gaining authority across social strata of both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. One of the many stories that can be followed when talking about Jewish esoteric knowledge in Eastern Central Europe is its standardization into a certain type of a manuscript book format. This process effectively removed certain Kabbalistic codices from circulation and placed them beyond the scope of contemporary academic studies on esoteric textuality. I have chosen to examine these formats, that is, on the one hand, deluxe, monumental display volumes alongside Kabbalistic recipe notebooks, to explore the boundaries of circulation processes and to consider how these different book formats, created within diverse scribal circles, both professional and semi-professional household circles, perform the ideological work associated with esoteric or Kabbalistic knowledge. Through material exchanges and manual labor, these formats defined the material and intellectual foundations of Kabbalah, each in its own way, transforming it into a major force of Jewish religious intellectual culture in Ashkenaz. So I'll begin my talk with a set of images of what became perhaps the staple of Jewish Kabbalistic textbooks in early modernity. This is the so-called Etz Chaim, attributed to Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, the charismatic leader of a Kabbalistic community in Palestinian Safed at the end of the 16th century. For a text that is so-called and attributed, it had an extraordinary career, flowing from its birthplace in the land of Israel to and between Jewish diasporic communities in Europe. Early accounts have it that Lurianic Kabbalah, that is a type of Kabbalah named after this Isaac Luria, the charismatic teacher from Safed, was initially not written down but circulated orally among Isaac Luria's disciples. It was later committed to writing by his students and then vigorously edited by several often competing groups and generations of their disciples. Knowledge of Lurianic Kabbalah first reached Central Eastern Europe in writing via letters, exchanged between those who claimed access to its Palestinian sources and traded that knowledge for material support for the local Jewish communities, a project targeting the social and financial elites of early 17th century Ashkenaz. These letters have survived only as copies in multiple text manuscripts and being partially printed, post-dating the original exchanges by about 3 decades. Embedded as fragments of early information about the new esoteric teachings and hagiographical stories on Isaac Luria, their modes of copying and placement among other Kabbalistic texts attest to the growing influence of this form of knowledge by the late 17th century, already not so novel and increasingly less esoteric. So the manuscripts whose images are displayed here on the screen come from the early 18th century, roughly a century after the first letters about Lurianic teachings reached Central Europe from Palestine. These volumes contain Etz Chaim, or in fact, the rendition of Etz Chaim called Derech Etz Chaim, a text that became one of the most successful attempts at systematic organization of Lurianic theoretical knowledge undertaken by one Mary Poppers, a Polish-born Kabbalist itinerant between Krakow, Jerusalem, and Lviv. His 3-volume anthology systematizing the enterprise of Lurianic Kabbalah, completed in mid-17th century, called Derech Etz Chaim, Pri Etz Chaim, Nov Etz Chaim, became the most frequently copied text of Kabbalistic nature in East Central Europe up to the late 18th century, both before and after they were first printed in the 1780s. The swift production and circulation of hundreds of copies of handwritten Derech Etz Chaim resembled a process of canon formation. The text gained status as an authoritative Lurianic handbook and soon became a central text for what is known as the Lurianic Kabbalah in Europe. While the success of Derech Etz Chaim was a large-scale phenomenon typical of a text that became a handbook put in motion, its manuscript publication in Central Europe, beyond the significant production numbers, also had unique local implications. In the span of 100 years from its emergence, the status of Lurianic knowledge among Central European readers of Kabbalistica became not only textually codified and in that way controlled, but even more importantly began to be customarily expressed through a new book format, that of a luxurious, monumental, handwritten codex of a codified Kabbalistic Summa. This format signaled not just a claim to reaching new participants in the esoteric knowledge network bound by this new Lurianic theosophy, but rather also novel ways of interacting with Kabbalistic knowledge, indexed by these bespoke objects of craftsmanship. The copy of Derech Etz Chaim on display was transcribed and decorated by Israel ben Asher of Selets in Lithuania, but active in Hamburg-Altona in the mid-18th century. This volume belongs to a series of near identical items, all on royal-sized paper in folio, executed in a neat 18th century Ashkenazi cursive, in what seems to have been a workshop of Israel ben Asher. As the prime scribe and decorator, he occasionally collaborated with other artisans on the manuscript decorative elements. The volumes are filled with pen and ink decorations. Pen and ink decorations and full-page penwork designs, embedding parts of explanative text and diagrams of Lurianic theory into busy Baroque-style cartouches supported by putti that exuded impressions of authority and were resemblant of the Central European post-Reformation visual models. In Hamburg-Altona in particular, which in the first half of the 18th century was a thriving Jewish scribal center, but also in other Ashkenazi locations, the idea of crafting a luxury item out of arguably the most complex of contemporary Kabbalistic theoretical works grew strong in the 18th century. From the first 2 decades of the 18th century comes another set of deluxe copies of Derech Etz Chaim. This set was produced by one Elkanah ben Shimshon of Lublin in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whose work too, at least for some time, can be associated with the book artisanal circles of Hamburg-Altona. Not much is known about this scribe and artist, apart from the work and anything that can be gathered from the objects that he produced. The extant copies were written on high-quality paper or in folio, meticulously designed and executed, and relied on the luxury value of handcrafted objects. At the same time, the scribe introduced to them elements that engaged with the style and aesthetic of hand-pressed books, already well familiar to the reading audiences in the early 18th century, and thus tapped into that current fashions and book expectations of the time. All 5 manuscripts that are extant are full textual copies of Der Chetz Chaim, that Lurianic handbook. 3 of them comprise the so-called second edition of that text, and 2 combine Popper's first and second edition of the text, providing textual correspondences in parallel columns. The volumes are almost devoid of corrections, erasures, deletions, or marginal additions. So here the scribal reverence for the text being copied met with textual acuteness. It appears that these volumes were produced for sale by a scribe who specialized in Lurianic, Kabbalistic bookmaking. His known work comprises only of the text of Etz Chaim, in knowledge of which he excelled, attesting to an attempt at exploiting the commercial potential of producing Lurianic Kabbalistic textbooks as handwritten deluxe objects for an affluent customer base. On the surface, Elkanah's books embed these carefully executed title pages, tables of contents, foliations, headers, and other bibliographic elements necessary for the ease of reading and expected in manuscript books that emerged under the pressures of print technology. Also, his choice of scripts displays this layered hierarchy. The shape of the square script used for some chapter subheadings and main titles emulate the most popular print models, emulating Spanish square script. However, for the most part, the manuscripts are realized in an Ashkenazi cursive script, one comprising elements employed for rapidity and flow of script, but far from the expectations of the visual experience of print or the ease of reading. For that, these manuscripts are hefty volumes, requiring means, time, and skill for their completion. At least in the case of the most lavish of them, an excellent contemporary binding approximates the weight that such a volume carried, literally and symbolically, when amplified by customized wooden boards. Casual manipulations of it was surely not an easy affair, nor was that book made primarily for that purpose. It bears no marks of being read, although it bears some marks of being used and handled in the shape of a few pieces of beard hair still extant between some pages. The aesthetic impact of these pristine volumes is quite striking, especially of the largest of them, now in the Bodleian Library. Here, the scribe deployed text designs resembled of the printed book, but also penwork decorations, which not only reflect the graphic norms of print, but also pen and ink flourishes and letter embellishments using graphic motifs commonly present in the late medieval and Renaissance local Ashkenazi repertoire of calligraphic art and manuscript decoration. So this choice does not seem accidental. Rather, it suggests that the scribe, and likely also the patron of the manuscript, were aware of its textual and cultural significance, thereby connecting the cachet of the Ashkenazi manuscript edition of the Lurianic Kabbalistic text with the visual signification carrying through the association with the local visual codes and manuscript craftwork. Employing these graphic norms had the potential of inscribing this new textual work within the local cultural values and their visual patterns, well known from historical and deluxe handmade items. And so Elkanah's manuscripts display an awareness of the local craft tradition employed skillfully in textual production, but also responded to specific graphic norms of print and the needs of readers accustomed to books as fungible commodities. These handcrafted objects equally engaged with handwritten and print technologies, a process which effected manuscript copies of serialized but deluxe appearance. Elkanah's copies are not the only examples of lavish handcrafting of Etz Chaim in Eastern Central Europe. Even more striking is this example of the Etz Chaim created in the 80s of the 18th century in Amsterdam by one Zev Wolf ben Mordechai Tzvi of Berestechko, who copied all the chapters of the Etz Chaim text, its second edition, across a 2-volume set. It is written in a non-square Sephardi script, Spanish script, modeled on the so-called Rashi typeface that is common in Hebrew print. Yet to each volume is appended a designed parchment title page, decorated in color and meticulously executed in Ashkenazi square and non-square script. This item too consciously employs these distinct text technological conventions appropriate for a mixed media scribal publication that was calibrated for Eastern Central European customer base and its tastes, possibly aligning with the broader architectural and visual aesthetic seen in contemporary wooden synagogue decorations, for instance. Though through the production and circulation of these manuscript volumes, some with notably short paths of transmission rather than circulation, from artisan to patron to current library holding, we can understand the expansion of Lurianic knowledge in Europe, not only in relation to other Kabbalistic esoteric texts, but also as a process contingent on objects that represented the commodification of Kabbalistic knowledge, with hierarchies and social cultural realities they both reflected and shaped. Their circulation patterns mirror how Lurianic Kabbalah spread in early modern Central Europe, rooting new forms of knowledge in the affluent European Jewish context, but also within the local visual and material culture, reflecting cultural aspirations and economic realities of the artisan-patron relationship fostered by the wealthy clientele of Hamburg, Altona, and other Ashkenazi urban centers. Though meticulously executed in terms of the quality of text, these objects interacted more with the visual and architectural conventions of Central Eastern Europe and performed their ideological work by embodying this local Ashkenazi version of the Lurianic Kabbalistic textbook within the familiar urban Ashkenazi setting. The textual repetitiveness and circularity of these works, often catalogued merely as copies or series of replicas of existing models, combined with modern catalogers' frequent disinterest in capturing the formal complexity of these products, has led to their exclusion from broader academic interests. Paradoxically, these monumental books seem to register their own cultural ephemerality, as they have tended to be interpreted primarily in relation to other standardized Etz Chaim texts and their variants. And today also their presence is rather invisible online. As you could see, the images I presented came either from the digitized microfilms or from my own photographic project, both coming with their own specific problems. Quite a different example of a Kabbalistic manuscript whose emergence was conditioned and also correlated with the appearance of the monumental Lurianic volumes, and whose meanings extended through the circumstances of its circulation, is this notebook of one Koppel Zussel, that is Schreibbuch, as it's signed off in German calligraphic script on the last page, by its apparent scribe and owner. On the 5th September 1762, this Koppel or Kappel Zussel Michael from Kronach in Upper Franconia inscribed his name on the first folio of this small notebook. It consists now of 116 near square folios in a format that conforms to the bibliographic design typical of writing manuals and copybooks. Indeed, the first folio of the manuscript does not bear the name of its scribe owner, only scribbled in Ashkenazi cursive script, but also in German, with a visible attempt at flourishing the cadence of the capital letters. The manuscript of Koppel Zussel in its current state is a composite volume made of two parts. The second, which bears the calligraphic inscription, is older than the first and can be dated to mid-18th century, while the first comes from the late 18th to mid-19th century. The earlier part is mostly uniform, with a consistent use of ink, paper, and script register. And between the last folio and the rest of the extant manuscript, several quires inscribed with what seems to have been Latin script were cut off. But most of the extant pages are populated by curated excerpts from Kabbalistic literatures and recipes of all kinds, from therapeutic to apotropaic to magical to technical to those of pure curiosity, both in Hebrew and Yiddish. What is extant in between is a collection of handwritten excerpts concerned with the questions of the afterlife, the world to come, and the resurrection of the dead. The only other genres with which the notebook intersperses the recipes are extracts from an almanac with calculations of festive days for the year 1740 and signs for relevant weather predictions, among pieces from several Kabbalistic texts. The latter are solely occupied with eschatological themes and with the theosophical underpinnings of these astronomical and ritual calendars. The notebooks thus include several short calculations with explanations of their meaning and application during ritual performances, adapted mostly from Lurianic Kabbalistic knowledge. Assuming that the hand of the scribe belonged to Koppel Zussel Michael, whose name was inscribed at the end, we can connect this manuscript to the household of the prosperous member of a Jewish merchant family. Koppel-Zussel's name comes up in the archival records from Kronach, which in the first half of the 18th century counted only 5 but well-connected and well-to-do Jewish families. Alongside his father, Zussel is recorded as having permission to frequent the Leipzig market, which he attended at least 16 times. He was a tradesman who dealt with local merchants and magnates and thus in need of good Buchhaltung and writing skills. But Koppel's family was also affluent and in possession of a library of quality. We know this from a list of books that Zussel acquired from his father after the latter's death, and which Zussel, in a good bookkeeping manner, noted in his Schreibbuch alongside their contemporary value. Excerpts from some of these titles appear in the notebook, digested by the reader and fitted into his apparent interest in calendrical and eschatological calculations on the one hand, and practical sciences, including those of practical solutions to medical, spiritual, psychological, metaphysical problems on the other. Koppel's household interests were diverse and apparently reflected in this manuscript. These interests were shaped by his various scientific endeavors and commercial engagements. Similarly, the roles and interpretations of Kabbalistic fragments fundamental to this manuscript mirrored its structure and contents, as the book could move through different sections of Koppel's household, between the book library to the space in which some of the more practical recipes were apparently tested. This movement through the household were crucial during the manuscript active use, highlighting the practical setting in which handwritten Kabbalistic texts circulated and were put to action. This notebook also acted as its owner and his family memory storage. Not only recipes from local practitioners and acquaintances of the scribe made it to this assemblage of recipes, but also records of birth and funerals of members of his family, list of valuables, occasional testimonies of testing of the recipes, or issues with the copying of some of the Kabbalistic texts. The manuscript holds later inscriptions located in Kronach too, so it seems that the book served the family as a notebook for at least 2 or 3 generations. The later codicological part, added sometime in the 19th century, not only conforms to the size of the older one, but also matches it thematically, comprising of medical recipes for a variety of remedies. So it appears that the kind of manuscripts like this of Koppel and the practical literatures and excerpts gained long-term significance and cultural value through this intergenerational transmission, despite their seemingly ephemeral nature. Pieces of Kabbalistic literature of various types, excerpted from often prohibitively long and complex volumes, appear here rewritten into short format of practical instructions, and they attest to a manner of engagement of a reader from a non-elite background with these texts' often complex contents. Koppel was well-versed in various literatures, it seems, but did not belong to the most educated layer of Jewish society, typically trained in Kabbalistic theory and practice. Handwritten and printed books of Kabbalah passed through the hands of readers like Zussel Koppel, who were well capable to extract from those texts that which was most useful or of immediate concern. They rewrote and adapted this Kabbalistic knowledge they read into flexible formats, best suited for their own interests, and as such could migrate across their familiar and semi-professional circles. The family surname signed across the book connects it with the familiar lineage, placing its transmission within the network of relatives. So zooming out of these 2 study cases of my talk, a side-by-side look at the manuscripts made for personal use, such as Koppel's practical notebooks, and at strictly scribal forms of publication made for sale, such as Elkanah's display volumes, highlights not only the multiple reasons as to why handwritten books, Kabbalistic books, were made in the first place, and the various uses they afforded beyond the idea of a transmission of text copied for reading. Embedded in class and economic relationships, these manuscript formats showcase different lines of movement, initially esoteric knowledge, restricted to learned circles of initiates through the hands of financial elites, becoming fixtures of households, fungible commodities, and participants of local material culture, consumed in many ways different to what ritual practice may have demanded from a learned Lurianic Kabbalist at the time. These textual objects, including the Kabbalistic text they contain, whether excerpts or full copies, lack inherent qualities that uniformly define them. Instead, their character and status evolve based on their purpose, repurpose, and application. This evolution lets us ask how interactions between books and people both through the physical labor of bookmaking, but also the spaces where books were handled, imbue meanings into the context for circulation, and transform the circulated knowledge itself, particularly knowledge that was originally socially restricted and not intended for circulation. Thank you.
Can we get Julia's slides up? Okay. I'm so happy to be able to introduce Dr. Julia King, who is a librarian at one of my favorite rare books and manuscripts collection, Lambeth Palace Library. She was previously a postdoc at the University of Bergen, where she also received her PhD in English literature. She is an expert, among other things, on Sion Abbey and the cultures of women's reading and writing there. She has recently published an article on Sion Abbey and the Strength of Weak Ties, which was published in Manuscript Studies. And she's also recently curated an exhibit this fall, which I think is done now, right? Which I wish I could have seen.
There's a digital version.
Oh, there's a digital version, and it's called Her Book, with an E at the end, Early Modern Women and Their Books at Lambeth Palace Library. Her talk today is called An Exploration of Two-Mode Network Analysis in 15th-Century English Devotional Literary Culture. Let us welcome Dr. Julia King.
All right, can everybody hear me clearly? Great. Thank you, Emily, for that really kind introduction. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Lynn, to Dot, to Nick, to the entire Schoenberg Institute and team for their organization and the invitation and funding that allowed me to be here today. What follows will be an exploration of both the circulation of books and manuscripts within a community, that is of Sion Abbey, which is England's first and only Birgitine monastery, and also an exploration of the practical consideration of network analysis, which is the method that I've used to analyze my science data over the past couple of years. What I want to get across is that while network analysis is an incredibly powerful tool that can be a game changer for people working with large corpora of manuscripts, there are certain things that need to be taken into account when using it. And in particular, what I want to do is break down what I see as the next major kind of roadblock for book historical network analysis. And this is something that I call the one-mode, two-mode problem. And I'll explain it more fully in a moment, but it's one of the main ways that the math of network analysis and the kinds of things that we as historians of manuscript circulation measure, so that is, in many cases, the movement of manuscripts and texts between people. They don't necessarily always match up, and sometimes they exist in tension with each other. Now, I should caveat that I have not solved this problem yet, nor am I the only person working on it. But I really do think that it's the next thing to address as a field. And I hope that over the course of the next 25 minutes or so, this will give you all a chance to kind of think about what needs to be done next. This is not to say that network analysis is the wrong tool for analyzing circulation. And in fact, as Emily alluded, I've used it myself very successfully. So what I want to do is the following. First, I'll explain my own work with network analysis, how I structured my networks, and the things that it led me to learn about Sion Abbey and the circulation of its manuscripts, just namely that the Sion sisters, who lived an enclosed life, were actually very active, purposefully so, in circulating books and texts in 15th and early 16th century England. Then I'll complicate it a little bit by describing the one-mode, two-mode problem. And discussing how can and can't networks answer the questions that we have about provenance and circulation. And then I'll finish by showing you some of my explorations into trying to solve this problem for research using a subset of my Sion data. And I'll point to some future directions for research and development. This all began as part of my larger doctoral project. And when I began it, I wanted to do two related things. The first was to find out more about Sion Abbey and how it fit into the already established networks I knew existed in late medieval England. But the second, which in some ways seemed more compelling to me at the time, was to see if network analysis could be used as an effective tool for this kind of work. And I treated it as a little bit of a scientific experiment. If I used the method network analysis on the data set Scion's books, what would happen? So for those of you who aren't already devotees of the best religious order in late medieval England, what is Scion Abbey and why is it so important? So Scion Abbey was founded in 1415 as part of King Henry V's great work, which sought to create a collection of religious houses west of London. As I said, Scion was England's first and only Birgitine house, and it was also the last monastic house founded in England before the dissolution of the monasteries. Despite this, it became the wealthiest non-Benedictine house in England by the time of its closure in 1539, which is wild. After the dissolution, the brothers and sisters of Scion, so it was a double house where men and women lived together but separated, they went into exile, and the monastery buildings in Isleworth were eventually dismantled, and the site is now home to Scion House, which is the neoclassical second London home of the Dukes of Northumberland. This is an artist's rendering of what Scion may have looked like. We actually don't know, but archaeology has revealed that it was really big. It was maybe even as large as the chapel of King's College, Cambridge, which is quite a large building. The exiled brothers and sisters lived on the continent until the 19th century, when they returned to England and they set up a new spot in Devon, so in the west of England. And the last Scion nuns actually oversaw the closure of the Devon Monastery in 2011. There were 3 of them left after nearly 600 years of the English Birgitine order. I told you they were great. And so they were the last surviving medieval religious order in England. Now, Birgitines were members of the Order of the Most Holy Savior, and they followed the rule of Saint Savior, which was a text that had been divinely revealed to the order's foundress, Brigida of Sweden, in a vision that she had received from Christ. And one of the unique features of this rule was that while it required the Birgitines to live a life of ascetic poverty, it also allowed them to have as many books as they wished for study. And that's the quote I have up on the slide here, which is possibly the most famous line in Scion studies. And I'm just going to modernize Middle English throughout. It says, "Though books they shall have as many as they will, in which is to learn or to study." So thus, Scion had 2 libraries, one for the brothers, one for the sisters, who, as I said, lived in the building together, but they were separated into these 2 separate enclosures. These libraries contained not only the standard liturgical works needed for the day-to-day running of services and individual devotions at Scion, but also the latest devotional works by authors such as Richard Rolla, Walter Hilton, in addition to works by the brothers written for the sisters, and then eventually for other women readers outside of the Abbey. So lots of the work done on Scion Abbey then has focused on these books, in part because of the unique ways in which books and Birgitine spirituality intersected, and in part because there's just a relatively large amount of extant source material related to Scion Abbey that you can work with, which makes studying it in detail more feasible. So the Scion Brothers Library Catalog, which is from circa 1520, survives. That's what you've got up there on the left there. As does the Scion Martyrologe, which is the kind of book of martyrs and donors to the library, which records donations to both libraries throughout their lifetimes. Other scholars like Mary Erler, Anne Hutchison, David Bell, and through the work that I'm discussing today myself, have used extant inscriptions and other codicological evidence to try to piece together the sisters' library, whose catalog doesn't survive, unfortunately. And we've been able to come up with about 60-odd books definitely related to the sisters in both print and manuscript. The Abbey's professed included ex-Oxford and Cambridge scholars, noblewomen, members of prominent gentry families, in addition to members of identifiable families in the home countries, so you can start to pick out who this social network is. Their patrons were also wealthy and influential. Donors included members of the royal family, London tradesmen and guild members, and in some cases, the families of the brothers and sisters themselves. Tutorial relationships between the Scion brothers and lay women, or between the Carthusian monks who were just across the river at Sheen Charterhouse and the Scion nuns, also yielded this circulation of books and texts kind of in and out of the Abbey enclosure. And then, of course, the almost simultaneous emergence of the London print trade meant that not only were patrons able to more efficiently produce books for the Scion sisters, but those books could then also be sold by those printers to an increasingly literate public. So the text written by the Scion brothers would be printed, often at the impetus of the Scion abbess, but they would actually reach a much wider reading public. So once you begin to dive into Scion's books, it becomes really clear that the circulation of texts and books, which I'm consciously using these 2 terms differently, since both types of circulation were occurring, these were happening both within this relatively small community of the Scion brothers and sisters, but they were also part of the wider bookish networks of pre-Reformation London. Although they were enclosed, they did not shy away from the outside world, and rather their actions do seem to reveal this kind of purposeful networking, which allowed them to share their books, texts, and their textual community with others. So to me, this seems like an ideal community for experimentation with network analysis. And so now I'm going to also very briefly explain what network analysis is for those of you who haven't yet joined the cult. At its most basic level, network analysis is math. I'm sorry, we will get through it together. It is the mathematical analysis of networked relationships or connected pairs of data. So in this case, with these bookish networks, you've got pairs of books and owners, books and authors, texts and the books that they appear in, or other similar kinds of pairs. So the actors in each pair are called nodes, and the action that they do is called an edge. And so you've seen these kinds of diagrams before. So you got those nodes there and they're connected. This line is an edge and that's another node over there. These shapes are what's called projected by a program that you ask to do network analysis for you. So in other words, the shape that your network visualization, which is the graphical product of network analysis, what it takes, it's determined by this algorithm that your program is using. Now, additionally, depending on what parameters you select in your program of choice, your nodes can be sized differently according to something called a centrality score. So that's what we've got over here with this big node and then these little ones over here. In other words, a node that is connected to other nodes more often might appear larger and more prominent to somebody who's doing an analysis of the image or of the stats in their kind of tabular form. And that's what you see there on the right. These centrality scores measure a different kind of influence within a network. So the person who has the most connections has something that's called a high degree centrality. But the person who seems to be the bridge between different groupings of nodes, so if you have one big blob here and one big blob here, and there seems to be one person in the middle, that person has what's called a high eigenvector centrality, and you can play around with these in your program. However, you don't even really need the visualization. Network analysis can be, and often is, done in the absence of any kind of graphic whatsoever. And big network visualizations can be actually quite difficult to parse visually. So instead, people will look at ranked lists of these centrality statistics, and they tell you a lot about the network, even if you're not looking at these visualizations. So I applied my network analysis to Scion's books, and I wound up with that, which consisted of about 550 nodes and 740 edges. Do not despair. I will break this down. This is actually pretty small in the world of networks. Big networks usually have tens of thousands of nodes and edges. But for my purposes, this was a neat little data set to analyze. Probably the most exciting outcome of my work was the material that I ended up writing about in the article that I published with the Schoenberg team in Manuscript Studies, which, as Emily mentioned, is called Scion Abbey's Books and the Strength of Weak Ties. So as a lens, I used this classic network analysis theory developed in the 70s by Mark S. Granovetter, which is called The Strength of Weak Ties. And actually, the article where he originally introduced this theory is one of the most cited articles ever in social sciences. So it's really actually quite influential. And basically, it says that information flows better in networks through weaker connections than stronger ones. So in other words, actually, in Granovetter's words, he says, whatever is to be diffused, so information, can reach a larger number of people and traverse a greater social distance when passed through weak ties rather than strong. If one tells a rumor to all his close friends, and they do likewise, many will hear the rumor a second and third time, since those linked by strong ties tend to share friends. So in other words, networks are pathways for diffusion, which sounds an awful lot like circulation, doesn't it? Applied to manuscript circulation, then you can start to hypothesize that by identifying these so-called weak ties, so acquaintanceship, distant family, somebody you spoke to once rather than the people you speak to every day, then you might also be able to find the people who are the most influential within a network for spreading this information, because they're the ones who are providing the texts or circulating them most widely. They provide novelty, basically. In the case of Scion's books, what I found out was that Scion's weak ties were the family members of individual Scion sisters who served as bridges between Scion and other religious communities. So, for example, the network identified a potential relationship between Scion Abbey and Dartford Priory, which was a contemporary kind of pure monastic house, through the figure of Marjorie Winter. So there she is there in the middle, who was a sister at Sopwell Priory, which was a dependent of St. Albans, before she transferred over to Scion. Her brother, Simon Winter, was a Scion brother, and her sister Emma Winter was at Dartford and is known to have owned or read a copy of the Discia Catonis, which is now Bodleian Rawlinson G59. Simon Winter's role in book circulation at Scion is well known because he was a tutor of Margaret Holland, the Duchess of Clarence, who is perhaps best known as Margaret Beaufort's grandmother. So that's what that little network is up here on the slide. So there's Marjorie, there's Simon, there's Emma, there's Dartford, Scion here. Margaret Holland eventually professes at a lay fraternity that I'll talk about in a second. And then she's connected to a whole whack of other people over there. So Winter wrote Holland a copy, and there she is, probably. Holland a copy of the Life of St. Jerome that exists in several copies, including one with us at Lambeth, which contains a passage in the prologue that's directly addressed to Holland. And what it says is, and that not only it should know it the more clearly to your ghostly profit, but also it should more abide and turn to edification of other that would read it, so this is the text, and copy it for yourself, and sith to let other to read it and copy it whoso will. So basically, read it, understand it, copy it, and get it to everyone you know. And evidently she did, because this text is found in numerous manuscripts which are now scattered across the world, including the oldest Cambridge CUL N19, which has been split into several parts that are again scattered. Beinecke 317, which has connections with not only Scion, but with Sion's close acquaintances at the Carthusian Charterhouse of Sheen. And in our collections at Lambeth, the Jerome text with the Winter prologue can be found in 432, which is the one I have up on the screen here, but also in another Lambeth manuscript, which is MS 72, which is a copy of the Golden Legend that contains that same Jerome text. So you can see that circulation. We don't yet have identifiable evidence that these books circulated along the Winter family line to other religious houses. There's no positive proof, but we do know, so if we go back to our family here, that Marjorie Winter, the sister from Sopwell who moved to Scion, witnessed Margaret Holland's later investiture into the lay fraternity at St. Albans. So Margaret Holland was known to maybe not the whole family, but at least to Simon and his sister. So from this, you can start to speculate, but you can do so in this informed way that your networks are suggesting for you. If Simon Winter, the brother, was trying to distribute texts through his student, then would he not also try to do so through his sisters? And this is your new avenue of inquiry, so it kind of spins on. So then from the purposes of thinking about manuscript circulation, networks become this really powerful modeling tool. However, it is absolutely vital to think about how network structure works, how the mathematics behind it work, and how your data choices and your data modeling serve both the needs of the network and the needs of your own research questions. So this is that intentionality that Lisa was talking about yesterday, right? Even though network analysis measures complex and nuanced relationships that can be hard to quantify, it, as I've said, is directly reliant on maths, most commonly matrix algebra and graph theory, if anyone remembers that from school. And so the data that you use has to fit that mathematical structure. So this quantitative or computational quality of network analysis is all important, both from the perspective of the creator, but also from the perspective of the analyst. The creator has to be aware that their data has to fit into this prescribed structure, but the analyst has to be aware that the graph and the data that they're reading has come from this representation of only pairs of nodes and edges, not any kind of objective quantitative truth about their research findings. So practically what that means is that when you construct a network, you're going to start with pairs of data, which you then feed into a network analysis program. And these programs use the math that I mentioned earlier to run the statistics that allow you to do the centrality measures that I use in the straight the weak tie studies. Flip back forward, and so there they are. In fact, instead of looking at the network visualization for strength of weak ties, I mostly looked at lists of statistics like this, and this is the pretty one from the article, but I have a lot of really gross Excel tables as well. So this is the table that identifies the winters. So if you want your network to be constructed properly, and for all of this math to work and create these measures, then you have to construct the data in these pairs. So for basic network analysis, not only do they have to be pairs, but they have to be pairs of the same type of thing. So this means you need pairs that are book and book, or person and person, or text and text. So if I give a book to Lisa, the pair would be me, Lisa, for example. If you don't have these consistent pairs and you try and get your Gephi or your Palladio or whatever other program that you're using to do the statistics, then your statistics won't actually mean anything because they actually don't work with the math that's behind it. So this kind of network analysis is known as single mode or one mode network analysis because the nodes you're examining are all the same type of thing within the network. However, and perhaps you've started to see the problem with this, here at the Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age for Special Theme Circulation, we are interested in the combination of books and texts that are circulated by people, or texts circulated in codices. You'll notice, for example, that my network of the winters that I showed you earlier didn't mention any of the texts or codices that I told you about, even though they're an important part of the research findings. So our natural impulse then is maybe to have a network where nodes can be manuscripts, but nodes can also be the people circulating those manuscripts. So in that example where I give a book to Lisa, you kind of want three nodes. You want me, and then you want the book, and then you want Lisa, right? Perhaps if we're feeling like a real challenge, we want to represent all three aspects of circulation, so books and text and people, with a little bit of metadata tagging and other data curation. This kind of a complex network is possible. It is what is known as a multi-mode network. The problem is that when you add on extra modes to your network, you're also adding more math for your network analysis program to perform, actually exponentially more amounts of math. And so for every extra modality you add on, your program has to do that exponential amount of work. And so at best, this requires extra power for your computer, and at worst, it will cause the whole program to crash and then lose your data. Ask me how I know. This is one of the major reasons why I made a one-mode network. So as I see it, there's a bind for a person who, like most researchers I know, has complex questions about circulation, but is not a trained computer scientist or coder. We have multi-mode questions, but we're limited by knowledge or circumstance to one-mode networking, and this is the one-mode, two-mode problem. This is not to say that there aren't workarounds and solutions for this problem, many of which have been put forward by social scientists, for whom network analysis has been a long-standing method and theoretical framework. One obvious solution to the problem of exponential calculation requiring a more powerful machine is to simply acquire a more powerful machine, either on one's own or through the IT departments of our libraries or our home institutions. However, this isn't necessarily feasible for everyone for financial, institutional, moral reasons. Another solution is to work around the problem and simply create the best one-mode network to answer your research question. And that's what I did with my Scion network, where my node pairs were two people or institutions connected by an edge that represented the gift of the book. So the node pairs that say Simon Winter, Margaret Holland, encapsulate this whole complicated kind of book exchange. This worked reasonably well for me in that I could answer my question and I came up with some new research directions. However, I found myself unable to represent the circulations of the associated manuscripts of the life of Jerome, so this approach, while feasible, does come with some drawbacks. And now, of course, this is what somebody will then, they'll listen to you say this whole long spiel about their problem, and they'll say, but you could just code it in R, you know. You could bypass the common humanities network analysis programs, which are currently Gephi, NodeGoat, and Palladio, and create networks using R, or I've also done a very fun workshop in Python that I promptly forgot because I didn't practice. This allows extra flexibility within the network, certainly, but for the individual research whose tech strategy, and I believe this is a common strategy among all of us here, follow the instructions on the tutorial, use common sense, and then Google your problems in Stack Overflow. This seems a bit difficult without the built-in time to learn that a lot of us don't have with our jobs where we are teaching and researching and working and dealing with the cataloging backlog. And then you also have to practice it. You can go to these workshops and they're really great, but unless you're like a language, spending dedicated time with it, it just disappears. So, however, I think there are probably two most promising options. So we've got a new network here. These are, and I'll zoom into different bits of it in a second. These are a whole group of the identifiable Sion Abbey manuscript codices, and they are connected by the texts that they share. So we're looking at codices and texts. So this is done in a slightly cheating way. It isn't fully a multimodal network, but we can still use our network analysis tools to measure these quasi-multimodal pairs and create some kind of data analysis that then aids in producing more fulsome research results. So this first method that I'm going to talk about is called knowingly cheating. Its formal name is compound network visualization. So a true multimodal network takes into account the differing node types and the underlying matrix structure of the network. And so that way it's able to, you know how I said that all shapes are projected. It projects them, keeping those different types of data in mind. And so your visualization becomes a lot more readable. This is what is one of the computationally hard things for the programs to do because of that exponential nature of the maths. Data entry is also equally challenging because the data again has to follow another set of math rules. So basically if you have, a bimodal networks where you have two types of things, when you're making your pairs always have to be connected to the different type of thing. You can't have, which we often do in manuscript studies, these incomplete data sets where you say, oh, well, these people are connected together, but this person is also connected to a text. It has to be person in text or text in person. You can't kind of mix the streams, cross the streams. I'm getting my references mixed up. Anyway, all of that aside, sometimes you just get frustrated and you say, what would happen if you just created all the pairs as you want them, as you see them, regardless of node type, regardless of mass, threw it into Gephi, and you saw what happened? That's what this is. This is that different data set. And I've used some basic centrality measures. So I've used something called community clustering, where it groups all of the things it thinks are similar together, and some degree centrality, so making the things with the most connections biggest, to start to try and make sense of it. This type of compound visualization is a recommended strategy for dealing with multimodal networks because even though it's not mathematically correct, it is still showing you something. Statistics do still indicate areas of some significance, even if they're not perfect. And this is how I've managed to get it to group genre, even though it's not absolutely correct. And then once the network has identified some basic starting points, we as researchers get to investigate the things that the network throws up as much or as little as we, the informed person, see fit. So you can say, oh, this looks interesting. I'm going to go to the library and try and figure it out. As a workaround, it's not so bad. However, as you can see, what happens is that you get a much more cluttered visualization. What it also does is sometimes it places undue attention on nodes that perhaps aren't as significant. So for example, this section of the network, which identifies manuscripts that share liturgical texts, shows that things like litany or psalter or this very nice and nebulous prayers are really significant, but that's just because they're common liturgical things, right? Nevertheless, this compound network is still showing me a lot more data and connection points than the same one would with only one type of node. Meanwhile, in this other section of the network, which has identified a grouping of composite manuscripts, individual codices here, so you see that big one up there for a Bodleian, I think that's a Latin one. That's huge, and that's just because it contains a lot of texts. And so neither of these are particularly analytically helpful, right? So another thing that you can do is you can flatten data. Flattening data requires the researcher to create their bimodal or multimodal graph, just like this one, and then ask their computer program to flatten it back down into a single mode one, which should cut a lot of the noise. So ideally, if I were to flatten the network that I've been showing you, it should collapse in and show me a statistically accurate one-mode graph. And there it is. It This requires some knowledge of Gephi plugins and ability to be patient while the program inevitably does not do what you want it to do. But in the reward in this case is this network that has flattened and removes these, it has removed the codices. So right now you just have texts that are connected to each other. Back to basic building blocks. So think about the nodes, the dots, those are texts, and the edges are a flattened connection that kind of metaphorizes that whole idea of being contained in a codex. This immediately, at least to me, starts to be a little clearer and provides some research directions. So if you look there, that's the Revelations of Brigida of Sweden, which is a super complicated text because it's half account, half liturgical text, and half historical document, right? It shows up as a bridge between a few different genres of texts. So the green at the bottom are those sermons that we were looking at earlier with the big composite manuscripts. And the reason that they're so snarled down there is that there are just a lot of them. We recognize the liturgical books in purple to the right, but what we see here are that Brigida's Revelations, and then more importantly up here where it says papal documents about Brigida's canonization, they seem to co-appear with the sermons, with the liturgical text, and the text related to the Revelations themselves. So there, the flattened network shows some research direction for a question about the circulation of Byzantine text within the late medieval English manuscript milieu. So the problems and potential solutions I've outlined are not perfect. If I somehow met a benevolent DH magician who could create the absolutely perfect thing, I would want something that merges and perhaps can even pull from linked open data. It would provide data visualization, but it would all be perfectly structured with good network analysis and statistical measures, all with a so easy it's laughable interface. So if you know a magician, get in touch. But the thing is, really, the best resource is the networks that we make ourselves. Last month I had the pleasure, I don't know if any of you were in the audience as well, of attending a 2-day workshop on medieval women in network analysis that was hosted virtually by Kathy Krause and Laura Moriali. So right in the niche of my subject area, and 200 people had registered for this online thing in the middle of term. It was great. I found out about projects I didn't know existed, and I found out most importantly that other people are working on the same kinds of questions that I am. I've been off in Norway for a very long time, which is very up and very over to the right of all of us here. Geographically, not politically. And so, I found out that, for example, Kalani Craig has been developing something called NetCreate, which blends network analysis and historical close reading. So you can enter your data and see your networks form at the same time, which is really cool. And it's a kind of data entry that works for humanists, and it's much less mathy, and it allows you to kind of see what you're doing. When I was based at a university, colleagues from other departments who looked at problems differently, so digital humanists, mathematicians, statisticians, and had different knowledge bases were invaluable. And of course, as is so often true in our field, simply cold emailing people whose work I admired was actually the most helpful thing. Our colleagues are very generous with their time and their information, and some of the things that I've learned from them have genuinely propelled my work forward in unpredictable but vital ways. The first panel was fantastic, and I learned so much, and I look forward to learning things from all of you over the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these excellent papers. I'm sure lots of people want to ask questions. We have about 15 minutes. Does anyone want to start?
Wow, thank you. Wow, the connection between those three go in these ways. I was really struck, it's an observation that maybe has a question in it, that Dr. Paluch, you were talking about how esoteric things become exoteric. And Dr. King, you were talking about how things that are visible and in the world, people, institutions, libraries, books, are made by you through network analysis into rather esoteric visualization. And that's really what I'm wondering about. So, Dr. Paluch, with respect to Kabbalah, I'd be interested to hear you put yourself in conversation with someone who's not here, but Yossi Hayes's work on Ilanot. And so you're tracing how texts that mainly have been shared by initiates and maybe written down, but only shared by a small group of people, become printed. They're also transmitted in manuscript by elite kinds of manuscripts, but also among popular copyists. And so there's a new opening of knowledge there. But I wonder about two forms of visualization. One of them is the diagrammatic, the emergence of diagrammatic Kabbalah in exactly this time period. And secondly, that through the visualizations of the diagrams, people have intentions, meditations, they have things that circulate based on, I admit, I wonder, in orally, in other words, if you have a teacher and he tells you, and it's mainly a he, but let's say it's both, and look at this diagram and focus on it, and they help guide you in your visualization. So where does that more visual part of Kabbalistic circulation occur? And Dr. King, I was really grateful to hear the way that you're putting digital humanists in relationship with digital scholarship, which is to say quals and quants. And I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on that in terms of your efforts to be a kind of a mediator between those two disciplines. Within the library, for example, between humanists and social scientists, but you're clearly right, in the center of an intersection, if you will, between two different methodologies of digital science, statistical as well as qualitative. So thank you both. I found this enormously illuminating.
Thank you for the question. There's no one good answer to it. There's a variety of ways in which diagrammatic visualization happened, both as in separate publications as broadsheets or within codices. And indeed, they could be put to use for pedagogical reasons, and they were in the circles of elite initiates, and that was their probably primary purpose and the way they were put to action amongst students of Kabbalah. But in the books that I was talking today about, what is interesting, the feature, is that these elements become elements of embellishment. And very often, in that sense, they stop being the guides to practice, but rather they become a sort of embellishments, commodities, beautifying elements that stop being read. And very often we have them purely preserved, often not unfolded, so they are there to perform other ways, other things to us as observers of these objects than guidance to actual theory of Kabbalah. And so that is this kind of re-esoterizing moment. So from esoteric knowledge, it becomes a tool to learning and to spreading knowledge, and then it becomes sort of frozen in a format that stops that knowledge from being further spread. So then there is this circularity of how knowledge functions within this economic, social form of a book, that I could say.
No, it's so ironic. I mean, it opens up and then
And closes itself.
it closes. Thank you.
Circulates. Yeah, thank you very much. That's really kind of you. I think you've hit on a point, which is that there is this big tension between qual and quant. There is, and I've just started kind of looking into this, a group of people who do big qualitative data, and that's usually done, well, in my reading, it's been done with archaeology methods and what happens when you apply archaeology methods to these qualitative problems, which makes me laugh because every time that I teach a book history course, essentially what I tell the students is, you are being an archaeologist of this book. What do you observe? You are right that I spend a lot of time in conversation with people who sit on either side of this divide. have this very strong memory of early on in my PhD sitting with a group of IT people from the library and with the scholarly team I was working with. And they just couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that not all of our books had titles. And we just couldn't quite get them to understand that when we're talking about a work, we're talking about all instantiations of, say, the Bible. And so it's just people with different sets of training that are trying to make sense of what other people are doing. So that can be the difficult part of it. But I think really that as humanists, we sit in this really nice position where what our training has asked us to do is to take a look at every single data point that we maybe haven't been trained to think of as data points. We just think of it as evidence, right? And then we start to interrogate the context behind it. We start to say, oh, well, you know, why is it in this format and why is it not in this other format? But we can, if we can kind of wrap our heads around the fact that we're doing this to numbers, we can do the same thing to data. It's not that different of a kind of mindset shift, right? And so if we are then looking at these networks and they are telling us something, we don't have to take it as, well, the network says that this is the most popular node, and so therefore this is the answer. We have the skill set built over years and years and years of experience of taking that just like a piece of physical evidence and interrogating it of, well, what data point went into this and how was this data structured and where did it come from? And so I think that kind of conversation can be really illuminating.
So there's a, is this on? Oh, I gotta switch it on. Because now it's on. Okay. So there's a question for Julia on Zoom from Laria Hokas. Thank you for a very interesting paper to Dr. Julia King. I have been trying to do multi-mode network analysis with 12th century texts and manuscripts, and I think that you are right in using the projection technique in multimodal analysis. You concentrated on the visual analysis in your talk, but I would like to hear your thoughts on mathematical/statistical analyses, especially in relation to network analysis on macro, mid-level, and nodal level features.
Oof. Thank you very much. So in this talk, I've focused on the visual aspects of network analysis, in part because it is much easier to do a talk that has lots of nice slides of network analysis on it than long lists of data. But as you say, what we are actually mostly doing when we're doing network analysis is that we are looking at these long lists of data. I find that when I am doing my analysis, I don't have a data set that I feel is big enough to be really truly differentiating between macro and micro level analysis, because once I break down from, you know, one community to another, what you start to see is that we really do only have 10 or 15 extant manuscripts from one group or the other group. So this is a challenge that I've also reached, and so I'm afraid I'm going to have to do this very disappointing thing of in a conference saying, I'm really not sure either, and if you find out, I would love to know. I think in any of these points, when we're doing this mathematical modeling, I'm less concerned with it being perfect than with it throwing up some kind of result. I think if I were to create a mathematically perfect data list of my Scion books, I would still have one or two mistakes in it because I work by myself on this project and I, you know, can only do so much of my own data cleaning. And so I am always going to get something that isn't quite exactly right. But at the same time, at least the way that I work, I haven't done as much of this huge statistical modeling. I use it more as a starting out point to go figure out where I want to go next in my, I guess we can call it traditional manuscript physical research. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's a bit about how I think about stats and research and the relationship between the two of them.
I was wondering, Dr. Paluch, I was wondering about non-Jewish readers of the 18th century luxury manuscripts and Christian Hebraicus, and do we have any evidence for them as customers?
In one case, there is a possible connection, so this is still not 100% certain answer. But in the case of the first set of manuscripts that I shown with this kind of Baroque style cartouche visualization of the Sephirotic structure, the first customer was most likely a Christian Hebraist who then transferred it to interested circles in royal Scandinavian courts, and that's how it now is in Uppsala Library. So it kind of went that route of people from non-Jewish circles acquiring that. Whether it was commissioned, that is unsure. We have no data about that. But there was definitely a customer base that could have potentially been the target of this particular type of production.
I was also wondering about the mercantile household at the end.
Yeah.
And what kind of use do you think, can you speculate, that the household was making of the Illyrian material? And you use the word practical.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if like Kabbalistic practice means something different when you're talking about a mercantile household.
Right. So the notebook is in majority a compilation of recipes of all kinds, practical, how to do anything practically. But there are interspersed Kabbalistic fragments in it. And elements from those Kabbalistic fragments migrate to those recipes. So some of them are sort of more magical rather than technical, but uses, for instance, something that is very popular in Kabbalah, which is numerological calculations to do a certain recipe ingredient. So there is clear connection between what there was in the center of the Kabbalistic, more theoretical text, and how then it got repurposed in extraction to more practical sort of procedure. Mostly there are sort of therapeutic, magical type of recipes. So there is a clear conversation going on within that handbook between what the main copyist was trying to extract from what seems to be his larger library, and then how it puts it in practice in trying to test something of it in actual working for the everyday life.
I've only taken one class on Kabbalah, and it was a long time ago, but our teacher, Joseph Dahn, said to us that we had all made a mistake by coming to the class in the first place, because it wasn't appropriate for any of us to be learning Kabbalah. And so that stuck with me. So I was sort of thinking about the appropriateness.
It was probably not
yeah.
appropriate in the sense of traditional Kabbalistic ban of studying this knowledge up to the age of 40. We think that the owner of the manuscript was younger at the time it started. But there were at the time, especially in the 18th century, many people who were going against this traditional learning Kabbalistic circles, trying to approach Kabbalah from everyday life need perspective. And because of this growing popularity of that lore, there was a lot of evidence that Kabbalah was kind of flowing from practical setting in the kitchen, in the medical environment, towards elements that were Kabbalistic elements that were embedded in the decorations of the rooms, synagogues, etc. So in that sense, it was impacting people also of different ages and genders, also, although it was on a different level. Obviously, it's not a study on traditional yeshiva setting that normally prescribed in the traditional acquiring of Kabbalistic knowledge.
I'm sorry, I remember now, there's some Hebrew books in Sinai. I wonder if there's anything in your network analysis now. Because Joanna Weinberg published an article about Robert Wakefield as a Hebraist, his knowledge of rabbinic literature.
Yeah.
And I don't remember the details right now, but her article took a turn to Sinai and the books that were there. And as a point of, she didn't make a network analysis, but as a point of access, like how do Christians read Kabbalistic and other sources of Jewish post-biblical material? And so I don't know if that ever came up or comes up, but I'd be curious to know. That is, anyway,
Well.
you just triggered a thought. Professor Stein.
The short answer is they're not in the sisters' library, they are in the brothers' library, which means that they were outside of the scope of my research project, but also the brothers' library is much, much larger than the sisters' library. There were probably about 900 books there. And that built up, a lot of it was built up because the brothers were these kind of ex-Oxford and Cambridge dons who, I think of it as their genteel retirement community. We've had this metaphor before today. But they bring their offices with them, more or less. And so I think that these books reflect not necessarily a Bürgertine mindset, but the scholarly mindset of the late 15th century that's leading into this. And so from that, I have to now kind of infer that were we to then start to network analyze the brothers' library, which if somebody wants to give me a lot of money and a lot of time, I could start doing, then you would start to be able to answer that kind of a question. But the short answer is it will have come in through the scholarly network, and they're probably engaging with it in that same kind of context that they would have done in the universities.
The bad news is that our time is up, but the good news is that there's coffee. So can we thank our speakers for this?
Yeah, I find out those.
Was she one of your students? I was 25. Yeah. Okay.